us some money. We have people who can handle this. This information did not filter down to me or many of the people involved. We found this out when I got back to Monrovia. I came to Monrovia, I believe, late March or very early April. At that time, because of the announcement that was made in February, the NPFL, of course, the cat got let out of the bag, and they started, they went after, they got information, said these people are Nimba Redemption Council people, so there was some combat. Amos Coco, who's in Philadelphia now, was there. He tells me that there was, combat along the border there for about 7 days, and he said 8 of the young men who were part of the team waiting for ecomog got killed as a result of this. And when we got to Monrovia, I got to find out from the ecomog commander, that was then General Malu, that they didn't intend to deploy anymore, that it wasn't, they had taken that option off the table. And at that point, I was really furious, and a lot of us were furious because this was not what we signed on to. What we signed on to was to see that the peacekeepers would be deployed with our help to minimize the resistance from the Taylor fighters. They selected me because they thought that, my voice would bring about a certain degree of credibility and influence that would lead to success. People who were in Nimba County have told me that when I went on BBC, Taylor basically surrendered Nimba and moved all his heavy artillery across the border to Bond County. Then he realized that there was nothing going on here. And so he came back with a vengeance. And when he came back, he started to target people who he suspected would be sympathizers of the Nimba Redemption Council. And that was a very tragic situation, and it's what breaks my heart the most about this. And, to all of those people and to their families, this is the one thing that I'm deeply sorry about the most. There's a gentleman here, Edwin Crua, and he told me about how his brother got tied, had no knowledge, nothing of what was going on, but his brother got tied and nearly got killed. And that was a very, very disappointing effect of what had happened and the deceit that we all experienced. I was not in Liberia during any of this time when the actual combat took place at the border. I had no responsibility for that. The late General Joseph Fangalo, who was military advisor to Sawyer, he wasn't really responsible for that. I mean, these guys, they were recruited to work along with ecomog. They had put together their own leadership structure, and the idea was that they would be there with ecomog. ecomog was going to be deploying, and they would be there. My job was to persuade our people to cooperate and to persuade the international community that this was in the best interest of Liberia and moving the peace process forward. And when we found out that that was not the case, that ecomog was not going to be deploying, that was the end of my involvement with the Nimba Redemption Council. After the Cotonou Accords, and that effort, by the way, had the result of motivating Taylor to call for the peace talks that then went to Benin, to Cotonou. And so, and that's when the concept of the five-man government was ushered in. And since then, we've had no involvement or support or likeness for anything military that strictly involved Liberians. I've always been of the view that Liberians had not been properly socialized to engage in military combat. So I always, I was not going to be a part of anything that just involved recruiting Liberians and, excuse me, and sending them in. There were many, I received a lot of proposals. At the time of the formation of the Liberian Peace Council, they were behind me to help. I said no. Liberia Peace Council was actually the AFL/Liberia Peace Council. George Boley was living in the barracks in the home of General Kerper, who was actually the force behind the Peace Council. The government was supportive of that effort. When they attacked Banga, they came after me, we need you to join us. I said no. And I've always stayed out of that. They were throwing the hints, we will form the government and we'll divide the ministries. That's not how I wanted to be a minister in Liberia. And so we stayed away from that, and that's so that's the extent of my involvement and what I know about the key elements of this conflict. I came back, and when Taylor got elected to as president, actually after 1996, the April 6th war. I was in Liberia at that time also, and when I left out, I didn't go back to Liberia again throughout the time that Taylor was president. So for the past 12, well, I went back in 2005, so for about 9 years, I didn't go back to Liberia. But I want to talk about what's happened to me also as a result of being in the diaspora, displaced by this war. When I came to this country in 1978, my plan was I would be here for school 6, 7 years, get a master's degree, go back home. And, in those days with an American degree, you were pretty much guaranteed a decent life. But because of all of this turmoil that was in the country, my father thought it was not a good idea for me to go back to Liberia then, and I've stayed. It's been a mix of, on the one hand, I feel blessed and fortunate that a lot of the terrible things that happened in my country, I was blessed and fortunate to be sheltered away from it. There's also a sense of guilt that my friends, my colleagues paid the ultimate price, in this conflict. There's also a degree of being homesick. My friend Wilfred Harris in Atlanta always jokes that we are the generation whose crops the locusts ate. At my age, when my father was at my age, he had already built 28 schools in the country. He was, he had led the county, built a lot of roads, had 2 homes, and had a rubber farm that was, up and coming and thriving, and had made a lot of personal progress in the country that he wanted to make the progress in. And this is where I wanted to live and make my progress. But all of this conflict has, constrained me from being a part of that, from living my adulthood in the environment that I dreamed to live in. I still do hope to achieve that dream. The other thing that's happened, which I've noticed, is that people who may have even participated in this war or didn't are fighting this war in America using some very dishonest approaches. I've been a community leader since I was in this country. 2 years or 3 years after I got here, I was elected to the board of directors of the Organization of Liberians in Minnesota. Liberian Association of Michigan, sorry. At the age of 23, I became president of that organization. It was a proud moment for me because we had people there in their 40s. I ran against two other candidates who were much older, much more experienced, but I won that election. I've always been involved in the Liberian community. I've been on the relief committee in Michigan during the war, and we raised relief supplies and sent them to Liberia. We did the same here for you. I distributed it in Liberia. But, you know, since this war, I've noticed here that people tend to use it to whip their friends in ways that really undermine our ability to reconcile as a community, come together, and thrive as a people. When I was running for president of this community last year, a lot of people had come to me and said, listen, we have a lot of challenges. We think that you can help, you know, to move this community forward, and we would like you to run. I said, you know, I would like to be returning to Liberia shortly, and I don't know if this is the commitment, but they prevailed, and I decided to do so. Even before I could publicly announce that I would be running for president, the internet began to show images of me superimposed on images from Rwanda, Darfur, Ethiopia, claiming that these were the victims of the Nimba Redemption Council. These were my victims. I was this humongous abuser of human rights, that I should not lead this community. You know, if you're running for president of the United States and people decide to swift vote you, you know, it's somewhat easier to understand because the stakes are high. But when you're trying to lead your community on a volunteer basis and people engage in these tactics, it's somewhat befuddling. And for me, it was like grabbing my father and killing him right before me once again. That was the most painful part of it. That was the most very painful part of it. And then even after I won the elections, beating my closest competitor by a 2-to-1 margin, they didn't stop. They went to the media. Before that, Winfred Russell, one of the candidates, I called the publisher of the Bush Chicken to say, listen, I just got off the phone I just came from Talakurumpa. She said to beg me, I must please win this election because this couple of Dwanyen man, what he did, all her brothers got killed in Nimba County. So please. So he called me to get my reaction to the story. So I immediately gave him Tala's phone number. What Russell didn't understand is that Talakurumpa is not from Nimba. She's a Kru woman who grew up in Monrovia. She has no brothers in Nimba. She married to Kurumpa from Nimba. And then, you know, they went to the media, and Emmanuel Dolo, who wrote a book on ethnicity, I helped him to write the book. I pointed out sources of research for him. He gave me credit in the book, made allegations to the reporter that I was this huge abuser of human rights, which he did not make in his book. And even the media stepped in and caused pain, where Randy First, who's the Free Star Tribune reporter, we both noted that he had a copy of Dolo's book, and we both noted that Dolo didn't make these accusations in the book, but he chose to quote Dolo. But he did not quote over 10 to 12 different people who gave him information to the contrary. He spoke to somebody who was living in Nimba at the time of the Nimba Redemption Council, the leader of the Nimba youth of Minnesota, who, you know, would have been able to be the most credible person as to what really happened in Nimba. And it was sad. Then, you know, Mashal newspaper, they had this story quoting a lady who said that they saw me in a park and recognized me. I was in the border area. She saw me in the border during the attack. and I was giving commands for people, to be killed. And he called me to interview me, and he told me directly that the lady was not credible, she was inconsistent. But he chose to quote her. And when I asked him about it, he said, well, she said she withheld her name, they withheld her name. Then he said, she said she was afraid for her life. So I was going to now kill her, when her name got exposed. The last time I was at the border with Ivory Coast and Liberia, and the one and only time was, I believe, 1972 or 1973. When I went along with my father to dedicate a highway because the Buto area wasn't accessible by road. During his leadership of the county was when that road got built. 1973, the one and only time I've ever been to that Ivorian border. At that time, the bridge, I believe there's a bridge there now, the bridge had not been built across the river. And it's sad what we are doing to each other here in this diaspora, fighting this war in ways which is very, very unhealthy and very, very unhelpful to our country. And that's something that I think is very important for you to take into account. And the saddest thing is, one of the person who was putting up all this stuff on the internet was the pastor for Prince Johnson, Benedict Grimes. As Prince Johnson would kill people, he would go there and pray over him. And he said that he was a spiritual advisor, and it's somebody that this commission needs to talk to, because they'll be able to have a lot of information about what actually happened on Caldwell base. So, we have a huge task ahead of us. Where do we go from here? I think in order for us to truly reconcile this country, there has to be a degree of accountability. 250,000 people cannot die in vain, and we say, let bygones be bygones. We have to know that we have to honor those victims. We can never, ever forget. I think we use the word forget in a different way. You can forgive and move on, but that's different from forgetting. We must always remember this, keep it in our consciousness, so that we never, ever repeat the mistakes of the past. Those with the greatest degree of responsibility for the atrocities need to be prosecuted. I know it is not practical to go and prosecute 10,000 people or whatever number of people you may find that actually were responsible, for the killing, but those who had command and control, those who were responsible, should be held accountable before a court of law. We also need to take a serious look at the way our country is structured. We have to decentralize political power in Liberia. We have to decentralize economic power, because all of this is a fight for state power, to protect oneself, and in some cases to enrich themselves. This war was not a revolution, it was a giant armed robbery. That's all it was. That was people's way to wealth. And the reason that we have this situation is that the monopolization of political power and economic power in Liberia has created so few other avenues for people to gain economic status that the only place they know how to rush to is to get a government job and steal. And the only way we can stop that is to decentralize that power. Let the people of Lofa County elect their superintendent, and not just elect them and say, okay, Mr. Superintendent, run to Monrovia for money to finance your operations. Lofa County is rich in timber, diamonds, and iron ore. A portion of those revenues should go to them by contractual agreement. They shouldn't have to go to Monrovia to beg for it. It's their money. Nimba County produced, before the war, 37% of the foreign exchange in Liberia. And there was no development in exchange for that. That type of concentration of power is a prescription for trouble. We need to prioritize education. When people are educated, they have a greater propensity to stay away from the types of things that we've seen. And let me qualify this. Education is not just the accumulation of knowledge in textbooks. It's also a socialization process. A socialization process that will create citizens that are empathetic, that are honest, and that are credible. Because we also saw that a lot of educated people did a lot of very evil things in Liberia because they lack empathy. And so our educational system must embrace these concepts, and it must embrace the concept that we, Liberians, have one common patrimony and a common destiny. Without that, we will continue to have this situation where people live as tribal nation states. It has not been good for this country. I don't think it will ever be good for this country. We have to also take seriously the socialization and conditioning and training of our military forces, be it police or the army. We cannot give them guns and unleash them without the proper indoctrination. Human rights, respect for the rule of law, respect for civilian authority has to be deeply ingrained in their mindset. There's been so much hurt in this conflict. So many people have lost everything. We have to do more than say, sorry, man. We have to put in a system for reparations. As we do that, let me be the first to say that I lost quite a lot. Besides my family, I lost a lot economically. We lost a lot economically. But I can take care of myself. I can take care of myself. Someone like me, if I should even be considered, should be at the back of the line. But let's look at that lady who had a small market that had maybe $200 worth of goods. She turned over maybe $20 a day, $10 of profit. That's what the family ate, and that's how they sustained themselves. And maybe the husband worked for the government and maybe made $100, and that's how they sustained themselves. She lost her husband. She lost her home. She's lost that business. We have to do something for her. We have to. We also need to memorialize the victims of this crisis. The victims of 1980, including our president, the victims of the 80s, and the victims of the 90s and the 2000s. We should have a discussion on how we do this, whether we have separate memorials or one memorial. I think that's a national discussion that we need to have as a part of the healing process, that people can understand that the loved ones did not die in vain, that the loved ones are not forgotten. As a result of the conflict that we've had since 1979, the symptoms of this long-running crisis, many Liberians have spent a very large part of their lives outside of the country. 2/3 of my life has been spent outside of Liberia. We have many citizens who have taken up citizenship in other countries. I have maintained my Liberian citizenship because of my desire to return to Liberia. But we have many of our compatriots who are now American citizens but still love Liberia very deeply and would love to make a contribution to Liberia and are making a contribution to Liberia today, building homes, sending money to family members, building businesses. We need to seriously incorporate the idea of dual citizenship